John Mitchell had always prided himself on building a fast food empire that stood for more than just quick service and low prices. It was about creating a brand that customers trusted, a brand that delivered quality consistently. His chain of restaurants had flourished under his leadership, with glowing reports from his management team and positive feedback pouring in from loyal customers. But recently, one of his franchises had started to show signs of trouble. There were complaints about long wait times, dirty tables, and, most concerning of all, a noticeable decline in service quality. His management team had assured him that everything was fine, that the issues were temporary, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He needed to see for himself. So, he decided to go undercover. Disguised in a baseball cap, a plain t-shirt, and jeans, John slipped into one of his busiest stores on a typical weekday lunchtime, hoping to blend in as a regular customer. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he hoped the truth would reveal itself quickly. As he walked through the door, the first thing that hit him was the noise, the clatter of trays, the hum of the fryers, and the sound of children laughing and crying, all mingling together in a chaotic symphony. But it wasn't the sound that unsettled him, it was the sense of disorder. The tables were cluttered, some with leftover wrappers and spilled drinks. The floor was streaked with grease, and the air felt heavy with a mix of oil and stale fast food. It was nothing like the clean, welcoming environment John had always strived for. He stood in line, waiting to place his order, his mind racing. The cashier, a young woman with a tired expression, greeted him with a half-hearted smile, her eyes unfocused as she scanned the menu board. There was a line of customers behind him, each one shifting impatiently, but the pace of service was slow, far slower than he had ever seen before. It felt like something was missing. When it was finally his turn, John ordered a simple meal, a burger, fries, and a drink. The cashier handed him his order with barely a word, and he took a seat in one of the booths, trying to observe everything around him. As he waited, he noticed how tense the atmosphere felt, like the employees were barely keeping it together. The kitchen was visible from his booth, and he could see the crew working at a frantic pace, but there was no sense of teamwork. The cooks moved hurriedly, heads down, hardly acknowledging each other, as if they were just trying to get through the shift without any drama. When his food arrived, it was handed to him by a young man who was clearly rushing through his duties. "Here you go," he muttered, not even making eye contact before turning away. John took a bite of his burger and immediately knew something was wrong. The patty was dry, the lettuce wilted, and the bun was soggy. It wasn't just a mistake in preparation, it was a lack of care. This wasn't the quality that had built his brand. He glanced around the dining area, noting that most of the customers seemed dissatisfied. A young couple sat near him, picking at their fries, exchanging looks that suggested their expectations had been unmet. A mother with two small children tried to manage the chaos of keeping them entertained while also attempting to get the attention of a server for a refill. It was clear to John that the restaurant wasn't running smoothly. But what was most alarming was the absence of leadership. No one seemed to be in charge. The staff members appeared to be operating in survival mode, merely trying to get through the shift, without any direction or motivation. A manager walked past him without even acknowledging the mess, her eyes glued to her phone as she strolled through the restaurant, completely detached from the chaos around her. John's stomach churned with a mix of disappointment and anger. This wasn't the business he had built, nor was it the reputation he had worked so hard to cultivate. This store had become a reflection of everything he feared: sloppy service, complacency, and a lack of accountability. He finished his meal quickly, not wanting to stay any longer. As he walked to the exit, He passed the kitchen again, and this time he couldn't help but notice the overwhelmed expressions on the staff. A cook had burned his hand on the grill, but instead of alerting anyone, he simply grimaced and continued working. Another staff member, clearly exhausted, was sitting on a chair in the back, rubbing her temples, trying to find a moment of relief in the madness. This wasn't just a matter of poor performance, this was a cry for help. John had come in expecting to find a few isolated problems, but instead, he had uncovered a systemic issue. His store was struggling, not just because of poor service, but because the people who worked there weren't being supported. They were overworked, undertrained, and, most of all, disconnected from the vision of the company. The realization hit him hard. His brand had become a business, but somewhere along the way, it had lost its heart. As John stepped out of the restaurant, the weight of his findings pressed down on him. This visit had opened his eyes to a deep-rooted issue that couldn't be fixed with a few minor adjustments. It was going to take real change. He couldn't just focus on the bottom line or the numbers, he had to reconnect with his employees, with his customers, and with the core values that had once made his restaurants a success. John knew what needed to be done. He would go back, not as the CEO, but as a leader who had to roll up his sleeves and rebuild trust, morale, and the spirit of his business from the ground up. This visit had changed everything, and now, it was time to make things right. John stood in line at the fast casual restaurant, his stomach growling in anticipation, but something felt off. The usual hum of the lunchtime rush was replaced by a tense energy that seemed to pulse through the air, thickening with each passing minute. The employees behind the counter were moving quickly but without purpose, their actions frantic and disorganized. The clink of plates and silverware, the hiss of the fryer, and the murmur of voices blended into a cacophony of confusion. As John shuffled forward, he caught glimpses of the kitchen through the open window, and his heart sank. The staff inside was equally overwhelmed, cooks scrambling to get orders out, a fry cook flinging fries into baskets with careless abandon, while others stood idly by, unsure of what to do next. The usual rhythm of the place, where everything seemed to flow seamlessly, had vanished. Instead, there was chaos. When it was finally his turn to order, John stepped up to the counter, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. He quickly ordered his meal, but instead of heading to the waiting area like usual, he found himself lingering, his curiosity piqued by the scene unfolding before him. As he stood back, observing the frenzied activity around him, his attention was drawn to a young employee, Samantha, who seemed to be at the center of it all. She was juggling multiple tasks, trying to prepare drinks while taking orders, but her movements were slow and uncertain. A drink spilled over the counter, splashing onto the floor, and her face flushed with embarrassment. She muttered a quick apology, her hands shaking as she wiped up the mess, but her discomfort only seemed to add to the tension that had already settled in the air. John's gaze shifted to the manager, David, who was standing nearby, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He was watching Samantha with an intensity that made John uneasy. As another mistake unfolded, a missed item on an order, a mistake that was hardly her fault in the first place, David's patience finally snapped. "Come on, Samantha. This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the kitchen. "How many times do I have to tell you? Get it together." The words were harsh, and Samantha flinched, her face turning pale as she tried to salvage the situation, but she was visibly overwhelmed. David's scolding only seemed to make things worse, her movements becoming more erratic and disorganized. Drinks were spilling over the counter, customers were growing impatient, and there was an undercurrent of frustration that seemed to echo off the walls. John felt a pit form in his stomach as he watched the scene unfold. He had been a regular at this restaurant for years, and while he understood that rushes could get hectic, this felt different. It wasn't just the usual lunchtime chaos, it was a breakdown, a failure of leadership and communication. Samantha wasn't just struggling with the rush, she was struggling because she didn't have the support she needed to get through it. John watched as she made a final attempt to hand over a drink to a waiting customer, only for it to slip from her hands, splashing onto the floor. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at the mess, before David stormed over. "Unbelievable," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "What's wrong with you today? You've got one job, one job." His words cut into Samantha, who was now on the verge of tears. The other employees remained quiet, their faces tense, their own anxiety building as they witnessed the exchange. John, still standing by the counter, couldn't help but feel a rising sense of injustice. Samantha was a young employee, clearly trying her best, yet David's constant criticism wasn't helping. It wasn't motivating her to work harder, it was breaking her down. The chaos of the kitchen, the disarray of orders, the pressure of an angry manager, and the looming sense of disorganization were all part of a vicious cycle that seemed impossible to escape. Samantha wasn't the problem, she was just one of the victims of a system that had failed her. David, instead of offering guidance or a helping hand, had become part of the problem, his scolding only serving to worsen the situation. John felt a wave of empathy for the young woman, and though he wasn't the type to get involved in workplace drama, something about the scene struck a chord with him. He had seen enough. He knew what it was like to feel overwhelmed by circumstances beyond your control, to have your mistakes magnified and your worth questioned. The tension in the air was palpable now, an oppressive weight that seemed to hang over everyone in the restaurant. Customers were whispering, glancing nervously at each other, some looking at their watches as the line continued to grow longer. The disarray had become impossible to ignore. John took a deep breath, his mind made up. He wasn't going to stand by silently. He stepped forward, his voice steady but firm as he addressed David. "Hey, I get that it's busy, but maybe a little encouragement would go a lot further than yelling at her. We all know what it's like when things get overwhelming. You don't have to tear someone down to get results." David's eyes snapped toward him, surprised by the interruption. For a moment, there was a tense silence, the weight of John's words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, David's shoulders relaxed, and he turned away, perhaps realizing for the first time that his approach wasn't helping anyone. John didn't expect anything to change in that moment, but he knew that sometimes, speaking up even for someone you didn't know could make a difference. He turned back to the counter, his own order finally prepared, but the image of Samantha standing there, helpless and overwhelmed, stayed with him as he walked out the door. He couldn't shake the feeling that the real chaos wasn't just in the kitchen, it was in the way people treated each other under pressure. John stood at the back of his restaurant, his eyes scanning the room with a sense of disbelief. It had been years of hard work, countless late nights, and a passion that had driven him to build this place from the ground up. He had carefully crafted every detail, from the menu to the atmosphere, from the customer service to the way employees interacted with each other. His vision had always been clear: quality, professionalism, and an unwavering commitment to making every guest feel welcome and valued. Yet, as he watched the scene unfold in front of him, his heart sank. The chaos in the dining room was palpable, and the once warm, inviting atmosphere now felt cold and suffocating. Samantha, one of his longtime servers, was attempting to clean up a spill on the floor, her movements hurried and clumsy. The mop she held seemed almost too heavy for her, and her stressed face told the story of someone overwhelmed by a situation that was spiraling out of control. As she wiped furiously at the mess, her eyes kept darting around the room, clearly anxious, trying to figure out how to keep everything under control. But she couldn't. The situation was beyond her capacity. John's gaze shifted to the other side of the room, where a group of customers sat in uncomfortable silence, glancing at their watches and checking their phones. They had been waiting for their food for what felt like an eternity, and while they were polite, their frustration was growing. The usual smiles and pleasantries that filled the restaurant had been replaced by subtle sighs and impatient glances. Their patience was wearing thin, and John knew it wouldn't take long before their displeasure turned into complaints, and worse, bad reviews. A pit formed in his stomach as he saw the strain on his employees. The kitchen staff was scrambling to catch up with orders, but they were clearly behind. Plates piled up in the window, waiting to be served, but no one seemed to have the time or the clarity to move them. The line cook was shouting to his colleagues, but it was unclear whether he was offering direction or just venting his frustration. In the front of the house, the staff looked frazzled, running from table to table but never actually getting anything done. The manager, who had been with the company for years, was standing by the register, his arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold without taking charge. He didn't seem to know how to solve the problem, nor did he seem willing to step up and take control. John could feel his chest tighten as he watched the disaster unfold. This wasn't just a busy night, it was something far deeper. Something had gone terribly wrong. The realization hit him like a wave, crashing over him with an intensity that took his breath away. His restaurant, the very thing he had worked so tirelessly to build, was unraveling right before his eyes. This wasn't a simple issue of bad timing or an occasional mistake. This was a systemic failure, one that had been brewing beneath the surface for some time. John had been so caught up in the day-to-day operations, so focused on the numbers and the next promotion, that he hadn't seen the cracks forming in the foundation of his business. He had trusted his team to uphold the values he had instilled, but now, standing there in the middle of the chaos, he saw just how much those values had been disregarded. Samantha, for all her dedication, couldn't carry the weight of the disorganization. The customers, for all their politeness, were visibly unhappy with the delays. The manager, who was supposed to be the leader, had failed to step up in the moment of crisis. And the staff, once full of energy and passion for the restaurant, were now tired, stressed, and on the verge of burnout. John's heart ached as he saw the damage to the atmosphere. The place that had once been vibrant, buzzing with life, now felt oppressive. It was a restaurant, but it was no longer a welcoming place. It was a business in survival mode, and the cracks were starting to show. As he watched his employees struggle, a deep sense of guilt began to settle over him. Had he been so focused on growth that he had neglected the culture that had made his restaurant special? Had he allowed complacency to creep in while he focused on expanding the menu or improving the decor? Had he put his trust in the wrong people, assuming they would carry on the values he had set, only to realize they hadn't? He couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just about one bad night, it was a reflection of something bigger. The values of quality, customer service, and professionalism had been compromised. The foundation he had built was crumbling. It wasn't just the employees who had failed, it was him, too. He had failed to recognize the warning signs, failed to nurture the culture that had made his restaurant a success. The burden of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. He had to fix this. He had to find a way to bring back the values that had once made this place a beacon of excellence. His mind raced as he began to think of ways to address the crisis. Immediate changes needed to be made: stronger leadership, better communication, a re-emphasis on customer satisfaction. But it wasn't enough to fix the surface problems. The heart of the restaurant needed to be revived, and that meant revisiting the core principles that had always guided him. As he looked around the room one last time, his resolve hardened. He wouldn't let this place fall. He would take action, even if it meant overhauling everything he thought he knew. This moment of realization was the beginning of something new, an opportunity to rebuild, refocus, and restore the soul of the restaurant. John had been observing quietly from the back of the room, his presence unnoticed by the staff as the tension between David, the manager, and Samantha, a junior employee, reached a boiling point. David was berating Samantha, his voice rising with frustration as she attempted to explain herself. The other employees, uncomfortable and unsure of where to place their loyalty, stood frozen in the middle, unsure of how to react. It was a toxic scene, David's harsh words cutting through the air, while Samantha's face turned bright red, her eyes downcast in embarrassment. The customers, sensing the discord, looked away, murmuring quietly to one another, already feeling the shift in the atmosphere. John had come into the store to oversee the day's operations, but as he watched the situation unfold, he felt a deep, growing unease. It wasn't just the disrespect in the air, it was the complete lack of professionalism. The brand he had built, the values he had instilled, were being chipped away with each passing second. No one seemed to realize the gravity of what was happening, but he did. The frustration that had been building inside him for weeks now bubbled to the surface, and he knew he could no longer stand by as a silent observer. Stepping forward into the center of the room, John took a deep breath, his footsteps breaking the tension in the air. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm, carrying an undeniable authority. "Enough," he said, his words cutting through the chaos like a blade. The entire room froze, the argument dying on the spot as the employees turned, their faces a mix of surprise and confusion. David's face immediately drained of color, and Samantha looked up, her eyes wide with shock. John held up a hand, gesturing for them to remain silent. "I'm John," he said, his tone steady, the weight of his words settling on everyone. "And I'm the CEO of this company." A wave of disbelief swept through the room. David looked like he had just seen a ghost, his expression a mix of surprise and defensiveness. Samantha's face flushed even more, her embarrassment now taking center stage. For a moment, no one spoke. They had all been caught off guard, their discomfort evident. John could see it in their eyes. This was the last thing they expected. And yet, in this moment of revelation, something shifted in the energy of the room. John's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension that had been hanging in the air, and his disappointment, though subtle, was palpable. He wasn't angry, but the weight of his words was enough to make anyone feel the gravity of the situation. "What I'm seeing here today is unacceptable," he continued, his voice measured and controlled. "What I'm hearing is disrespect. I'm hearing an atmosphere that completely undermines the trust our customers have in this brand, and that's something I will not tolerate." His gaze swept over the team, and he could feel their unease. Samantha shifted uncomfortably, still reeling from the sudden turn of events. David, on the other hand, stood frozen, his jaw tight with defensiveness, unable to respond at first. John paused for a moment, allowing his words to settle before continuing, making sure the gravity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. "We built this company on trust, on mutual respect, not just between customers and staff, but among the staff themselves. I'm not here to chastise, but to make it clear that behavior like what I just witnessed has consequences. It doesn't matter how busy or stressed you are. If you let that stress turn into hostility, if you treat your co-workers or customers with anything less than respect, you jeopardize everything we've worked for. The silence that followed felt heavier than any reprimand could have been. David, who had been ready to argue, found himself speechless, his usual confidence shaken. Samantha, caught between shame and relief, felt the sting of John's words settle in her chest, and for the first time, she understood the weight of what she had allowed to happen. John wasn't just speaking to them, he was speaking to himself, to the company, and to the values that had gotten them to where they were. His disappointment wasn't a show, it was real. He wasn't angry, but the pain of seeing his company fall short of its standards stung deeply. "The way forward is simple," John said, his tone softening just slightly. "You all need to take a long, hard look at how you treat one another and how you treat the customers who walk through those doors. If we want to maintain the reputation we've worked so hard to build, it starts here, with every single one of you. And I expect changes. Immediately." The room remained still, the weight of his words lingering in the silence. John's gaze lingered on each person present, and though he didn't raise his voice, his message was loud and clear. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't letting them slide by with excuses. There would be no more tolerance for disrespect. "I don't care how stressed you are or how difficult things get," he continued, his voice unwavering. "I expect you to handle those challenges with professionalism and respect. If you can't do that, you're not the right fit for this company." With that, John turned on his heel, signaling that the conversation was over. As he walked away, the room remained frozen, the employees digesting what had just transpired. David and Samantha stood in stunned silence, their faces a mix of regret and reflection. For the first time in a long while, they realized that their actions didn't just affect their co-workers, they affected the very foundation of the company they worked for. The confrontation had been uncomfortable, but necessary. And as John disappeared from the room, his parting words echoed in their minds, a challenge and a call to action. The time for change had come. Samantha stood in the dimly lit office, her hands trembling at her sides as she fought to keep her composure. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision, but she blinked them back, determined to face the consequences of her actions. The chaos in the restaurant that had unfolded over the past few weeks, the missed orders, the late-night shifts that felt endless, the discontent and tension between staff members had finally reached a breaking point, and she could no longer ignore it. She had always prided herself on being a strong, capable leader, but today, in front of John, her vulnerability was undeniable. "John," she began, her voice shaky, the words a struggle to get out. I'm so sorry for everything. The mistakes, the miscommunication, the stress. I know I've let you down, and I don't know where to start." Her voice cracked as the weight of it all pressed down on her chest. The tears she had been holding back began to fall, and she wiped them away quickly, embarrassed by the emotional outburst. She had spent so many hours working herself into the ground, trying to keep the restaurant running, but the pressure had built to a point where she could no longer maintain control. "I've been under a lot of pressure lately," she continued, her words slower now as she gathered the strength to speak her truth. "But I know that's not an excuse. I've been making mistakes, and I've been so overwhelmed by everything. The truth is, the atmosphere in this place, it's been toxic for a while now. I've tried to handle it on my own, but I see now that it's affecting everything. It's affecting the team. It's affecting the customers. and it's certainly affecting me. She took a shaky breath, her eyes fixed on the floor as she spoke, unwilling to meet John's gaze at first. It was hard to admit, hard to confess that she had failed in ways she hadn't even realized until now. She knew she wasn't the only one feeling the strain, the entire team had been struggling, and she had failed to notice how much the toxic environment had taken its toll on them. The constant pressure, the lack of support, the constant fight to keep things moving forward, it had all created a perfect storm of exhaustion and frustration that no one knew how to address. John listened quietly, his expression unreadable but attentive. He had always known that Samantha had been a dedicated manager, one who cared deeply about the success of the restaurant. But he also knew that she had been carrying an impossible burden, one that no single person should have to bear alone. As she spoke, he saw how hard it was for her to admit the truth, how much it weighed on her to finally open up about the dysfunction that had taken root. He didn't interrupt her as she poured out her heart, and when she finished, he took a moment to let the silence settle between them, gathering his thoughts. Samantha waited, her hands still trembling, unsure of what to expect. She had braced herself for anger, for disappointment, for perhaps even the end of her time at the restaurant. But instead, John's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and steady. "Samantha, I'm not going to pretend that what's been happening is okay. You know that. And I'm not here to make excuses for anyone, least of all myself. But what I do know is that you're not alone in this. I know the pressure you've been under, and I know it's been tough. You're part of this team, and you've been doing your best, but I can see that you've been carrying too much on your own." John paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "This isn't just about you. It's about all of us. And it's clear to me now that we need to make some changes. Not just for the sake of the restaurant, but for the sake of the people who work here." Samantha's heart fluttered in her chest as she absorbed his words. He wasn't angry, he wasn't laying blame at her feet, he was offering something else, something she hadn't expected. Understanding. Compassion. A promise that things would change. "We're going to do better, Samantha. We're going to make sure that this restaurant isn't just a place that runs on stress and pressure. We're going to work on building a better, healthier environment for everyone here so you don't feel like you're doing it all by yourself. And so no one else has to feel the way you've been feeling." John's words were both reassuring and challenging, a reminder that the road ahead would take work, but also a chance for redemption, for growth. "You've got a chance to turn this around. And I believe you can do it." Samantha stood there for a moment, the weight of the situation still hanging heavy in the air, but now there was a sense of lightness starting to creep in. She wasn't going to carry this burden alone anymore. She wasn't going to try to fix everything by herself. John's leadership had set a new tone for the team, one of mutual support, open communication, and accountability. It wasn't going to be easy, but with John's reassurance and commitment to change, Samantha felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. "Thank you, John," she whispered, her voice steady now, though still thick with emotion. "Thank you for understanding. I'll do everything I can to make things right." As she turned to leave, a sense of relief washed over her. The road to redemption was long, but it had just begun. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The changes would take time, but she now had the support she needed to move forward. And in that moment, she knew the atmosphere in the restaurant, and in herself, could start to heal. David stood in the back of the restaurant, just out of sight, watching the confrontation unfold before him. The tension was thick in the air as John, his longtime friend and colleague, spoke with the team. David had always prided himself on being a hands-on manager, someone who didn't shy away from putting in long hours and ensuring everything ran smoothly. But as John's voice echoed through the room, pointing out the cracks in the restaurant's culture, David's sense of pride slowly began to crumble. He had been so focused on getting results, so consumed with the pressures of running the place efficiently, that he hadn't noticed the toll it was taking on his team. His once vibrant crew was now weary, stressed, and increasingly disengaged. They had stopped smiling, their enthusiasm for their work had dwindled, and the energy in the restaurant felt heavy. David's heart sank as he listened to John speak about the importance of a positive work environment, about how a manager's role wasn't just to demand results but to guide, support, and nurture the growth of his employees. It hit David like a wave. He had been critical, harsh, and demanding, pushing his staff to their limits without realizing that, in doing so, he was eroding the very foundation of the restaurant. He wasn't fostering collaboration or support, he was creating an atmosphere of fear and exhaustion. The truth stung, and as John continued, David's mind raced, replaying moments when he had snapped at his team for minor mistakes or when he had ignored their concerns, thinking that pushing harder was the solution. He had been blind to their needs, focused only on outcomes and deadlines. But now, with John's words ringing in his ears, David understood how much he had taken from them in his pursuit of perfection. He realized he hadn't been the leader they needed. He had been too focused on the bottom line, too obsessed with maintaining high standards at all costs, without considering the human element of leadership. The faces of his employees flashed through his mind. Amy, who had worked tirelessly but now barely looked him in the eye, Carlos, who used to joke around and make the kitchen a fun place, but now kept his head down and said very little, Sarah, who had recently started staying late to finish her shifts but never seemed to be able to keep up with the demands anymore. David hadn't seen it at the time, but now it was all so clear. He had been pushing them beyond their breaking points, expecting them to give more than they had to give. They weren't machines, they were people, and he had failed them. The weight of his actions sat heavily on his chest. He had thought he was doing what was best for the restaurant, but now he saw the damage his leadership style had caused. He had created a culture where employees feared failure more than they felt supported to grow. He had placed too much emphasis on perfection and efficiency, forgetting the importance of fostering a sense of belonging and trust. As John wrapped up his speech, David felt a deep pang of guilt, but also a glimmer of clarity. He knew that change was necessary, but it wasn't just about adjusting policies or giving the team more time off, it was about changing himself. David had to become the leader his team needed, one who recognized their strengths, valued their contributions, and supported them through challenges instead of constantly pushing them to their limits. He understood, now, that leadership wasn't about demanding excellence, it was about creating an environment where excellence could naturally flourish, where people felt empowered and motivated by respect, trust, and understanding. As John finished speaking and the team began to disperse, David remained standing in the back, lost in thought. The quiet of the restaurant around him felt different now, calmer, more reflective. He realized that this moment was a turning point, not just for the restaurant but for himself. He could no longer continue with the same approach. If the restaurant was to improve, if the staff was to find their energy and passion again, he had to change. David had always believed that leaders were supposed to be strong, decisive, and in control, but he now understood that true leadership was about humility, empathy, and the willingness to grow alongside those you led. It was about being a guide, not a dictator. He would start by having honest conversations with his staff, asking them what they needed from him, and listening without judgment or defense. He would take the time to recognize their hard work, to offer encouragement and feedback that was constructive and supportive. He would invest in their development, not just their output. And most importantly, he would foster a culture of respect, trust, and open communication, where everyone felt valued and understood. As David walked into the restaurant the next day, he could already feel the weight of his realization beginning to shift the atmosphere. He knew it wouldn't be easy to undo the damage he had caused, but he was determined to try. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. He wasn't just managing a restaurant, he was leading a team, and that was something he had to earn every single day. John stood at the back of the store, his eyes scanning the busy floor as the morning rush unfolded before him. It had been weeks since he had implemented the changes he hoped would turn things around, and while the road had been anything but easy, the transformation was beginning to take shape. The operational chaos that had once defined the store was slowly being replaced by something far more promising: a sense of order, purpose, and renewed energy. When John had first arrived, the atmosphere had been thick with tension. Employees, overwhelmed by the demands of the job, had become disengaged, their frustration palpable. Samantha, the store manager, had been doing her best, but the pressure had taken a toll on her. David, the assistant manager, had been struggling to maintain morale among the team. The lack of proper training and resources had left them feeling unsupported, and the constant turnover only deepened the sense of instability. The stress of managing peak hours was evident in every corner of the store, from the long lines at the registers to the exhausted faces of the staff. It was clear that something needed to change, and John knew that if the store was going to thrive, it couldn't just be about fixing the surface-level problems. It had to be about addressing the deeper issues that had been plaguing the team for months. The first step was to recognize that leadership was the key. John implemented a series of changes, beginning with comprehensive leadership training for Samantha and David. They were both capable managers, but the stress of their roles had left them feeling disconnected from their teams. The training provided them with new tools to manage the chaos, strategies for prioritizing tasks, methods for managing stress during peak hours, and techniques for improving communication within the team. John also recognized that the rest of the staff needed support, so he invested in better training programs for everyone. These weren't just about teaching the technical aspects of the job, they focused on teamwork, problem solving, and creating a sense of ownership in the store's success. John's goal wasn't just to create a well-trained team, it was to foster an environment where employees felt empowered, confident, and supported. He also understood that resources were a critical part of the equation. For too long, the team had been expected to perform with limited supplies, subpar equipment, and little assistance during the busiest times. To remedy this, John made significant investments in the store's infrastructure, bringing in the necessary tools, improving inventory management, and ensuring that the store was adequately staffed during peak hours. Slowly but surely, the results began to show. The store, once a place of constant chaos and stress, was transforming. The team, under Samantha's and David's leadership, began to work more cohesively, communicating better, and approaching the daily challenges with a new sense of confidence. The leadership training had given Samantha and David the tools they needed to guide their team through difficult situations, and the improved resources allowed the staff to work more efficiently. Even the most stressful times, like the long lines during lunch hours, were being handled with greater ease. The customers began to notice the difference. It wasn't just about the speed of service, it was about the atmosphere. There was a new lightness in the air, a sense that the team was not just getting through the day, but actually thriving. The energy in the store shifted. No longer was it a place of tension and exhaustion, but a place where people worked together, where employees could smile and joke with customers, and where they felt proud of the work they were doing. The improvements were visible not just in the smoother operations, but in the faces of the staff. Samantha, who had once been visibly stressed and overwhelmed, now carried herself with a sense of calm authority. She had a newfound confidence, knowing that she had the support she needed to lead the team through even the most difficult moments. David, too, had grown into a more confident leader. He was no longer just reacting to problems but was anticipating them and addressing them proactively. The bond between them had strengthened as they collaborated more effectively, and the staff began to mirror that sense of teamwork. One of the most striking changes, however, was the sense of empowerment among the employees. They no longer felt like cogs in a machine, working to meet demands without any recognition of their efforts. They were now part of a team that valued their contributions and recognized their importance. When challenges arose, they faced them together, supported by the training and resources John had provided. They were no longer simply employees, they were collaborators in the store's success. The store was now a place of growth, both for the employees and for the business. The changes John had implemented were not just about improving operations, they were about creating a culture of respect, communication, and empowerment. Samantha and David, once bogged down by the pressures of their roles, were now thriving in their positions. Their leadership had become a beacon for the rest of the team, setting the tone for how the store would operate moving forward. The positive energy was infectious. Employees were smiling more, helping one another, and even taking pride in the work they were doing. Customers, too, noticed the difference. They were greeted with more enthusiasm, the service was quicker, and the overall experience was more enjoyable. John could see it in the way the staff interacted with the customers, the way they worked together seamlessly, and the way they took ownership of their roles. The store, once a place of stress and tension, had been transformed into a thriving, supportive environment. The journey hadn't been without its challenges, but as John stood there watching his team, he knew that this was just the beginning. There would always be room for improvement, but they had taken the first, most important step toward building something better. Together, they had turned chaos into harmony, stress into confidence, and uncertainty into pride. The future, once unclear, now felt full of promise. It was, indeed, a new beginning not just for the store, but for everyone involved. As the weeks passed, the restaurant, once burdened by negative reviews and a tarnished reputation, began to experience a quiet yet powerful transformation. The efforts of the team, guided by David's newfound leadership and the positive changes that had been instilled, were starting to pay off in ways both visible and tangible. The feedback from customers, once riddled with complaints, slowly began to shift, with glowing reviews now flooding in. Patrons, returning to the restaurant with cautious optimism, were impressed by the noticeable improvements in service. They spoke of the warmth with which they were greeted, the attentiveness of the staff, and the newfound energy that filled the space. Word of mouth spread quickly, and it was no longer just the food that drew people back, it was the experience itself, an experience that felt genuine, welcoming, and fresh. Samantha, once overwhelmed and unsure of herself, had blossomed in her role. No longer doubting her ability, she now greeted each customer with a confident smile, exuding a calm assurance that had been cultivated by the new, supportive environment David had fostered. She had learned to embrace the importance of her role, no longer seeing herself merely as another server but as a crucial part of the experience, someone who could make a difference in how customers felt. Each interaction was an opportunity to show them the positive changes that had taken place. David, who had once struggled to find the right balance between authority and empathy, had fully embraced the leadership methods he had been hesitant to try at first. His approach had shifted from being reactive to proactive, from distant and authoritative to calm and supportive. He now led his team not with harsh demands but with a steady hand, offering encouragement, guidance, and an unwavering belief in their potential. He understood that leadership wasn't just about directing, it was about empowering those around him. His support had given his team the confidence to rise to the occasion, and as a result, the restaurant's atmosphere was filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The kitchen staff, once tense and under constant pressure, now worked together seamlessly, their energy reflected in the food they served. Every plate that left the kitchen wasn't just a dish, it was a reflection of the collective pride of the entire team, from the chefs to the front-line staff. The customers felt this change. They saw it in the way the servers moved with purpose, in the attention to detail in the service, and in the friendly faces that welcomed them as if they were family. The restaurant was no longer a place filled with frustration and confusion. It had become a space where both employees and customers could feel at ease, confident in the experience they would receive. As David walked through the restaurant one quiet afternoon, taking in the sight of his team working harmoniously, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. The transformation he had hoped for, though gradual, was happening. Samantha's confidence, the team's unity, and the positive shift in customer interactions were signs that the changes had not just been superficial, they had truly touched the heart of the business. David knew that the success wasn't about one person or one action, it was about creating an environment where everyone felt empowered to contribute to the overall experience. The team now felt valued, not as workers filling a shift, but as integral pieces of a puzzle that, when all the parts fit together, created something much greater than the sum of its parts. The restaurant's reputation, which had once been on the verge of collapse, began to rebuild itself piece by piece. The improved service, the renewed energy of the staff, and the consistent quality of food all came together to form a new narrative, one where customers were no longer disappointed, but instead eager to return. They saw the restaurant for what it was, a place that had taken ownership of its past mistakes and worked tirelessly to make things right. As the business steadily improved, so did the morale of the entire team. They could feel the change not just in the way the restaurant was viewed, but in the way they viewed each other. The shared sense of accomplishment, pride, and respect created a bond that had been missing before. They knew they were all working toward a common goal, not just for their own success, but for the success of the business and the satisfaction of every guest who walked through the door. In the months that followed, the diner was no longer just a place to eat, it was a symbol of resilience, of the power of transformation, and of the lasting impact of positive leadership. For John, who had been hesitant to return for fear of what he might find, walking into the restaurant and seeing firsthand the changes was a deeply emotional moment. He observed Samantha's confident smile, David's supportive leadership, and the engaged energy of the staff. The restaurant had turned a corner, and it was now stronger, more vibrant, and more connected than ever before. As the positive reviews continued to pour in, and the diner began to regain its rightful place in the community, John felt an overwhelming sense of pride in the team's ability to rise above the challenges they had faced. It was proof that with the right leadership, commitment to change, and a team willing to embrace new ways of working, anything was possible. The journey of rebuilding had been hard, but it had been worth every step, for the restaurant was now a place where both customers and employees could feel valued, respected, and hopeful for the future. John had always believed that a great restaurant wasn't just about serving food, it was about creating an experience, one that brought both employees and customers together in an environment of mutual respect, shared goals, and exceptional service. When he first took over the restaurant, things weren't looking great. The team was disjointed, communication was poor, and the customers could feel it in the atmosphere. Mistakes were frequent, morale was low, and the restaurant struggled to maintain a consistent level of quality. But John was determined to change that. He knew that true success could only be built on the foundation of teamwork and strong communication, so he set out to rebuild both from the ground up. The first step was listening. He spent time with each member of the team, from David, the sous chef, to Samantha, the head waitress, and everyone in between. He heard their frustrations, their ideas, and their dreams for the restaurant. He realized that many of them simply felt unappreciated or unheard, and this disconnect had created a cycle of poor performance and burnout. John made it clear that the restaurant was not just his business, it was theirs too. He emphasized that each team member's role, no matter how small it seemed, was crucial to the success of the whole. Slowly, things began to change. David, who had once been hesitant and unsure of his place in the kitchen, began to take more initiative, helping to fine-tune dishes and mentor younger staff. Samantha, who had struggled with managing a sometimes chaotic dining room, found a renewed sense of confidence in her role, bringing new ideas to improve customer service. The other team members, inspired by the changes, also started stepping up, bringing their best selves to work each day. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted dramatically. There was a new energy in the air, a sense of pride in their work, a shared commitment to excellence. It wasn't just about getting through the shift anymore, it was about making sure that every plate served and every interaction with the customer reflected the values of the restaurant: quality, care, and attention to detail. John encouraged open communication, creating a space where feedback was not only welcomed but actively sought. Team meetings were no longer about reprimanding mistakes but celebrating progress and brainstorming solutions to challenges. The culture of the restaurant had transformed into one of collaboration, where everyone felt supported and empowered to do their best. Customers began to notice the difference. The food was consistently delicious, the service was seamless, and the atmosphere was welcoming. People came not just for a meal, but for the experience, the feeling that they were valued and appreciated, not just as patrons, but as part of the restaurant's extended family. Word spread, and soon, the restaurant became a model of excellence within the company. The change wasn't just about the food, it was about the environment they had built together. John's leadership had turned the restaurant into a place where employees felt valued, motivated, and proud to be part of something bigger than themselves. The success of the restaurant was no longer measured solely by the profits it made, but by the culture it had fostered, a culture where both employees and customers felt heard, respected, and important. David, Samantha, and the rest of the team had grown immensely in confidence and skill. They had learned that a successful business wasn't just about working hard, it was about working together, communicating openly, and supporting each other. They knew that they were not just clocking in and out, they were building something meaningful, something lasting. John looked around at his team, feeling a deep sense of pride. They had come a long way since those early, uncertain days. The changes they had made were more than just operational improvements, they had transformed the very spirit of the restaurant. John was proud not just of the success they had achieved, but of the way they had achieved it, with integrity, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to each other's growth. For him, the restaurant's success was no longer just about the bottom line, it was about creating a space where people could thrive, both as individuals and as a team. The lessons they had learned about teamwork, communication, and customer service had transcended the walls of the restaurant, becoming the foundation for everything they did. As the restaurant continued to thrive, the team remained dedicated not just to the work, but to each other. They knew that success was built not on individual effort, but on collective action, on a shared commitment to creating an environment where everyone felt valued. And with John's leadership, they had built just that, a restaurant that was a reflection of the values they held dear, a place where everyone worked together to create something extraordinary. The future looked brighter than ever, full of possibility and promise, and John knew that this was just the beginning. With a team this strong, dedicated, and united, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. What they had built together wasn't just a business, it was a legacy of excellence, a testament to the power of collaboration, communication, and caring for one another. The restaurant had become a true reflection of what they had achieved, a stronger, more unified business where everyone, from the staff to the customers, felt like they mattered.